Henry Carter sat in his spacious, quiet living room, watching the gold watch on his wrist while checking some documents on his tablet. This was the same luxurious environment he designed to impress visitors, with each piece of furniture carefully selected, reflecting his meticulous personality and the absolute control he liked to exercise over everything around him. The house was a monument to his success, but also to his isolation. Since the death of Catherine, his wife, Henry, had become a shadow of what he used to be. Where he once had a sparkle in his eyes when talking about business, everything now felt mechanical, repetitive, and cold. At 38, Henry was one of the most successful businessmen in the United States, owning a chain of luxury hotels around the world. He had everything money could buy, but something was missing that he could not quite define. Perhaps it was the growing sense of emptiness that had come since losing Catherine, or the distant look in his son Lucas's eyes, which he ignored for fear of confronting his own feelings. For Henry, showing emotion was a sign of weakness, a concept he learned early in life that helped him climb the corporate ladder. The clock struck 6:30 p.m., and he finally decided it was time to head to the office. He was about to grab his keys when a call from the manager of his home interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Henry, I just wanted to inform you that Clara arrived a little earlier today. Lucas has been asking for her since this afternoon." Henry frowned. Clara, Lucas's nanny, was someone he did not know much about. He had hired her on recommendation and, until then, was satisfied with the fact that she took care of his son while he was at work. To Henry, Clara was just an employee, a cog in the system he had set up to ensure his personal life did not interfere with his business. "Okay, thank you for letting me know," he replied, ending the call without giving it much thought. But that afternoon, something compelled him to return home earlier. Perhaps it was the uncomfortable feeling that he was losing something important. Upon entering his home, he found a silence different from the usual. A silence broken only by the sound of laughter coming from upstairs. It was Lucas's laughter, a sincere, joyful sound that Henry had not heard in a long time. Intrigued, he followed the sound to his son's room, and peering through the slightly open door, he saw Clara with Lucas in her lap, stroking his hair and whispering something that made him smile. She then placed a gentle kiss on the boy's forehead before putting him in bed. The gesture made Henry's blood boil. To him, it was an invasion of a space he believed belonged solely to Catherine. Even after so long, he still saw his wife as the only person who could show that kind of affection to Lucas. Seeing Clara repeat that gesture did not make him feel tenderness, but rather anger. He pushed the door open forcefully, causing Clara and Lucas to turn around, startled. "I don't want you to kiss my son again," he said, not hiding the contempt in his voice. "You're just the nanny. You have no right to act as if you're part of the family." Clara stood still, surprised by Henry's sudden reaction. She knew he was a reserved man, but she hadn't expected to be confronted so harshly. "Mr. Henry, I was just trying to comfort Lucas. He was talking about his mother and—" "That's none of your business," Henry interrupted coldly. "Your job is to take care of him, not to get him emotionally involved. What he needs is routine, not illusions." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she held firm. "I understand, sir. I'm sorry if I crossed a line. I just wanted him to feel loved." Henry took a deep breath, struggling to maintain control. "Love is not your job, Clara. You'd better remember that." With those words, he turned his back, leaving her standing in the room, trying to disguise the pain and shame she felt. In the following days, Clara continued to take care of Lucas as always, but avoided any gesture that could be interpreted as intimacy by Henry. She still hugged and talked to him, but there were no more goodnight kisses or caresses on the forehead. Lucas seemed to notice the change and asked why Clara didn't kiss him goodnight anymore, but she only smiled and changed the subject. Henry, for his part, went about his routine as if nothing had happened, but the image of Clara kissing Lucas would not leave his mind. He tried to rationalize, telling himself he was right to maintain that distance. After all, money and discipline were enough to raise a child, weren't they? But he had no idea what awaited him 2 days later. Leaving the office early for a video conference meeting, he returned home intending to use his private office. Once again, as he entered the residence, he heard laughter coming from upstairs, this time accompanied by a different sound, like a soft murmur. His heart raced a little faster, and he followed the sound to Lucas's room, expecting to see a scene similar to the one he had witnessed before. What Henry saw when he peered through the slightly open door, however, left him speechless. Henry remained frozen at the door, watching the scene unfolding before his eyes. Lucas's room had been transformed. Instead of the impeccable, cold arrangement he demanded, there were cushions scattered across the floor, colored pencils and papers everywhere. In the center of that colorful chaos, Clara and Lucas sat laughing as they drew together. It was the first time Henry had seen his son's room like this. He always insisted on a nearly military organization, as if maintaining order could keep away the chaos he felt inside. But there was Lucas, amidst the mess, with a wide, sincere smile, something Henry could hardly remember seeing since Catherine's death. Lucas held a blue pencil while Clara pointed at a drawing that looked like a woman with long hair. Henry furrowed his brow, trying to understand what they were drawing. Then he heard Clara's soft, warm voice. "Lucas, is this your mom? It's so beautiful. You drew her smiling." "Yes," Lucas said excitedly. "I remember she always smiled at me. Sometimes I dream about her, and she tells me she's taking care of me up in heaven." Henry felt his chest tighten. It was a pain he tried to hide in every way possible, but there, hidden behind the door, there was no escaping it. He wanted to push that feeling away, ignore that conversation, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. Clara wiped away a discreet tear before responding, her smile full of tenderness. "She's definitely watching over you, dear, and she knows that she would be very proud of you. I'm also very happy to see you drawing like this." Lucas looked at Clara with shining eyes. "Do you really think she would be proud?" "I'm sure, Lucas. And you know, even when you miss her, you can remember that she will always be in your heart. That's something no one can take away from you." Henry saw Clara caress Lucas's face, and for a moment he felt a strange warmth. A warmth he didn't recognize. That exchange of affection, those gentle words. How could someone he considered just a nanny talk so sincerely about feelings he could not express? He didn't want to admit it, but he felt powerless, watching how Clara could reach Lucas in a way he, with all his money and power, never could. But what came next was what truly dismantled the armor Henry carried. Clara knelt to be at eye level with Lucas and, in a low, soft voice, asked, "You miss your mum, don't you?" Lucas nodded, biting his lip to hold back tears. "Yes, a lot. But I know she's taking care of me. I just wish she were here for real." Henry closed his eyes for a second. His son's desperate longing struck deep, bringing forth a guilt he tried to stifle. He had failed to fill the void left by Catherine's absence, and he was starting to realize how much it affected Lucas. Clara sighed and, for a moment, seemed to hesitate. "I know it's not the same, Lucas, but I'm here. I will always be here for you. You are a very special boy, and I will take care of you, okay?" Lucas smiled and suddenly hugged Clara tightly, as if he needed that affection to keep from getting lost in his sadness. Henry couldn't believe the intensity of that moment. He couldn't believe how right it felt, but there was more. Clara picked up one of Lucas's drawings and carefully began to add something. She drew a heart around the figure of the mother, and inside it wrote a simple phrase, "Love is forever." Lucas looked on and, after a moment, smiled once more. I like this, Clara. It's beautiful. It is, Clara agreed, because love never ends, even when we can't see the person. Those words echoed inside Henry as if she was speaking directly to him. Something inside him, something he kept locked away, began to stir. The reality of how he had been distancing himself from his own son became even clearer, and the strength he had always considered his greatest virtue now felt like a weakness. Henry knew he had to interrupt this. He couldn't keep hiding, watching, pretending that this scene didn't affect him. But before he could take any action, Lucas said something that nearly made Henry's heart stop. "Clara, I love you." She hugged him without hesitation and replied, "I love you too, Lucas. You're like a ray of sunshine in anyone's life." It was then that Henry realized what he had never wanted to admit to himself. Clara was everything Lucas needed, and what he, Henry, had never managed to be. And that terrified him. He felt a paralyzing fear of losing control, of letting someone break down the barriers he had built to protect himself and Lucas. He hated the idea of depending on anyone. But there, in the simplicity of that exchange of affection, Henry began to see how flawed his understanding of love and family truly was. Unable to bear it any longer, Henry took a step back and left the hallway, his heart racing. He didn't want Clara to know he had witnessed everything, nor did he want Lucas to see him in that state. He headed to his office, closing the door behind him and collapsing into the chair, feeling a mix of anger and despair. How had he let it come to this? How could a simple nanny, someone he barely knew, be the emotional anchor for his son? Henry couldn't accept that. He didn't want to accept it, but at the same time, he couldn't deny the truth Clara had revealed without even realizing it. Lucas needed something he, Henry, was failing to provide. And that made him question everything he believed about control, strength, and most importantly, about being a father. Henry spent the night awake in his office, rereading contracts and reports that, no matter how important, could not distract him from the thoughts swirling in his mind. He tried every possible way to ignore what he had seen, but the image of Clara and Lucas laughing and drawing together would not leave his head. No matter how much he tried to convince himself he was right to impose limits, something within him knew he had crossed a dangerous line by distancing himself so much emotionally from his own son. The next morning, Henry sat at breakfast but had no appetite. The aroma of fresh coffee and the clattering of utensils sounded distant, as if he were oblivious to his own home. Lucas came down the stairs excitedly, holding the drawing he and Clara had made the day before. He ran to the table and extended the paper to his father. "Daddy, look, Clara and I made this yesterday. It's Mom," Lucas said, with a radiant smile. Henry looked at the drawing, observing the childish strokes trying to capture Catherine's image. The simplicity of the drawing and the evident affection in every line made his heart ache. He knew he needed to react, say something, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Henry merely forced a smile and said, It's beautiful, son." Lucas waited for more, as if he hoped his father would make some comment that showed a bit more interest. But when he saw that Henry wouldn't say anything beyond that, the boy's smile faded slightly, and he lowered his eyes to the drawing. "Clara said I can draw Mom whenever I miss her," he said, almost justifying what he had done. "Clara said that?" Henry asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "She shouldn't fill your head with those things, Lucas. You need to focus on other things, more real things." Lucas looked confused, but before he could respond, Clara appeared in the dining room doorway. She wore a soft smile on her face, but upon seeing Henry's expression, her smile disappeared immediately. She understood that something was wrong in the air. "Good morning, Mr. Henry," she said, trying to be cordial, but not hiding the tension in her voice. Henry turned to Clara, and for the first time since confronting her, their eyes met directly. I'd like to talk to you in my office, Clara. Now. Henry's tone was firm, making it clear this was not an invitation but an order. Clara hesitated, casting a worried glance at Lucas, who seemed about to say something but fell silent. She nodded and followed Henry down the hallway to the office, where he closed the door as soon as she entered. "Mr. Henry, if this is about what happened yesterday, Be quiet," he interrupted her with a cutting coldness. "I don't want to hear excuses. You need to understand that there's a clear line between you and my family. And you keep crossing that line repeatedly." Clara took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Sir, I understand that you want to protect Lucas, but he misses his mother. He just needs a little comfort. And who are you to decide what my son needs?" Henry stepped closer, his voice growing more intense. "You're just the nanny. Your job is to ensure he is safe, fed, and educated. You have no right to act as if you're more than that." "And what do you think he needs, Mr. Henry?" Clara asked, not backing down. "Because he needs something that no amount of money can buy. He needs to feel loved. He needs you." Henry blinked, surprised by Clara's audacity to challenge him in that way. No one spoke to him like that. He was used to controlling every situation, having the final word in everything. But there was Clara, standing her ground, facing him as if she were not afraid of him. "I'm giving him everything he needs," Henry said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "I do everything for him." "Except being present," Clara replied without hesitation. "Sir, I see how Lucas looks at you. He just wants you to be there, to be more than just a distant and authoritative presence." Henry opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He felt a knot in his throat, a feeling he didn't want to admit with shame. No matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, part of him knew Clara was right. He had built a life in which everything was under control, except for the most important thing, the relationship with his son. Clara continued, her voice softer now, but still firm. "Mr. Henry, I understand that you are going through a difficult time. I don't know what it's like to lose someone you love so much, but I see Lucas's pain, and he needs someone to help him through it. He needs kindness and gentleness, and if I can give him a little of that, I will, even if you don't like it." Henry felt the blood rush to his face, a mix of anger and helplessness. He was about to yell at Clara, to fire her, but something stopped him. It was as if a part of him was battling against the other. He wanted to be in control, but at the same time, he knew Clara was the only one truly caring for Lucas. And that infuriated him because deep down, he knew it was true. "You're fired," he finally said, his voice cold and calculated. "I want you out of my house by the end of the day. I'll arrange for an extra payment for your month, but I don't want to see you here again." Clara froze, shock and pain etched on her face. She had prepared for a reprimand, for a discussion, but not for that. "Mr. Henry, please think about what you're doing. Lucas will—" "I don't care," he cut her off with a firmness he himself could barely believe. "I'm his father, and I decide who stays and who goes. Now leave." With tears in her eyes, Clara slowly nodded. She knew there was no more arguing to be done. "All right, Mr. Henry, but I hope you realize what you're losing before it's too late." She left the office without looking back, leaving Henry alone, breathing heavily. He expected to feel a sense of victory, of regained control, but all there was a growing emptiness, a hole that seemed to widen with every second. He looked at the closed door, and for a moment he wished he could take back the words he had said. But pride still outweighed guilt, and he remained there, convinced he had done the right thing, even if everything inside him said otherwise. The day Clara left Henry's house was strange and silent. Lucas noticed the commotion, saw Clara packing her things, and bid her farewell with a long hug that seemed to never want to end. He did not exactly understand why she was leaving, but he knew something was not right. When he asked his father where Clara was, Henry simply replied in a dry and evasive tone, "She's not going to work here anymore." Lucas did not cry. He simply fell silent, and for the first time in a long time, his gaze became empty, as if the light Clara had brought into his life had been extinguished. Henry tried to ignore his son's expression, but that image followed him throughout the day. It was as if he were seeing his own emptiness reflected in Lucas's eyes. That night, Henry tried to follow the routine. He put Lucas to bed, read a short story, and turned off the lights in the room. But as he was leaving, he heard his son call his name. "Daddy, can you stay here with me until I sleep, like Clara used to?" The question caught Henry by surprise. He hesitated, remembering the harsh words he had used with Clara and the firm decision he had made to maintain control. "Lucas, I can't. I have work to do. You'll be fine alone." Lucas lowered his gaze, but did not insist. Henry left the room and closed the door, feeling a pang of discomfort he tried to ignore. He thought he had done the right thing by setting clear boundaries between what he considered appropriate and what was not. But more and more, those boundaries felt like walls, and he felt trapped on the other side, unable to reach his own son. The next morning, while Henry was having breakfast and reading the newspapers, the house manager, Robert, approached him. "Mr. Henry, may I speak with you for a moment?" Henry looked over the newspaper, impatient. "What is it, Robert?" "It's about Lucas. Well, let's say he's quieter than usual. He didn't want to eat last night and barely spoke to the other staff." "They're concerned," Henry frowned. "It's just a phase. He'll get used to it. With all due respect, sir, I don't think it's just that." Robert hesitated before continuing. "Lucas formed a very strong bond with Clara. Perhaps her leaving has affected him more than we expected." Henry felt a wave of frustration rise. "I've made my decision, Robert. Clara is not coming back. I'll hire someone else who is more appropriate to care for Lucas. That's all." "I understand, sir, but perhaps it's not a matter of replacement." Robert chose his words carefully, knowing he was treading on dangerous ground. "Sometimes, what children need is not someone else to fill the void, but someone willing to be truly there." Henry didn't respond. He simply returned to reading his newspaper, ignoring the knot forming in his stomach. But Robert's words echoed in his mind throughout the day. He began to wonder if he really knew his own son, or if everything he knew was an idealized and controlled version he had created for himself. Meanwhile, Lucas spent the day wandering the house, lacking his usual energy. He played with his cars, but soon lost interest and sat by the window, looking out at the garden. The staff tried to distract him, but nothing seemed to work. He was waiting for something, someone, and deep down, Henry knew that someone was Clara. In the days that followed, the house felt emptier than before. Lucas hardly spoke, and when he did, it was only to ask when Clara would return. Every time he asked that question, Henry's response was the same: "She's not coming back." And every time he said that, he felt as if he were breaking something inside himself. That week, Henry tried to focus on business, throwing himself into work as he always did whenever something bothered him. But not even the numbers and spreadsheets could drive away thoughts of Lucas and Clara. He began coming home earlier, thinking that perhaps if he were more present, Lucas would feel better. But the reality was that he didn't know how to be the father his son needed. He tried, but all he managed was a forced imitation of affection. One night, after yet another failed attempt to connect with Lucas, Henry went downstairs and sat on the couch alone. He picked up one of the drawings Lucas and Clara had made, which was still on the table, and studied it. It was a simple drawing, but full of color and life, and in the corner there was a phrase written in Clara's careful handwriting: "Love is forever." Henry felt something break inside him. Love was forever. But then why did he feel so lost? Why did love seem to drift further away, even when he did everything to try to protect it? He remembered Clara holding Lucas, talking about Catherine as if she were a living part of the boy's memory, and realized there was something he would never be able to offer, that simplicity and sincerity that came from the heart, and that scared him. The next day, Henry decided to do something he rarely did. He cancelled all his meetings and stayed home. He wanted to observe Lucas, try to understand what was wrong, and somehow fix it. He discreetly followed the boy around the house, seeing how he wandered aimlessly, how his joy seemed to have been drained, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the truth was there, clear as day. Clara's absence had affected Lucas in a way he hadn't expected. Seeing his son sitting in the garden, looking at the sky with a lost expression, Henry made a decision. He needed to talk to Clara. He didn't know exactly what he would say, but he knew he had to correct a mistake that was consuming everyone, especially Lucas. He picked up the phone and looked for Clara's number, hesitating before dialing. Each ring felt like an eternity, and Henry felt his heart race as if he were about to make a decision that would change everything. When Clara answered, her voice sounded calm but a little distant, as if she were preparing for a difficult conversation. "Mr. Henry, what happened?" Henry took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Clara, we need to talk. I think I made a mistake." On the other end of the line, there was a long silence. Clara seemed to ponder what he had said, and Henry could not predict how she would react. He had always known what to expect from people, but Clara was different. She wasn't someone he could control with money or authority, and maybe that was what scared him. When she finally responded, her voice was soft but firm. "If you want to talk, I'm willing to listen. But first of all, you need to understand that this isn't just about me or you. It's about Lucas. He is what matters." Henry closed his eyes and nodded, even knowing Clara couldn't see him. "I know," he said, with the honesty he rarely used, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." Henry hung up the phone and stood still for a moment, trying to process what he had just done. Asking to talk to Clara was something he never imagined he would do. He had always prided himself on his ability to make quick, definitive decisions without hesitating or backing down. And now, here he was, trying to undo a decision that seemed so clear and rational just days before. Later that afternoon, Clara arrived at Henry's house. She entered through the front door, and instead of being greeted with the usual formality, she found a tense atmosphere, as if the entire house was suspended in a state of waiting. Lucas, who was playing in the hallway, froze upon seeing her and rushed to her, hugging her with all the strength a 5-year-old could muster. "Clara, you're back," he exclaimed, his voice filled with relief and happiness. Clara knelt down and hugged him back, tears in her eyes. "Hi, my dear. I missed you so much," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I'm only here to talk to your father now, okay?" Lucas looked up at her, confused, but nodded. "Okay, but you're coming back, right?" Henry, who was watching the scene from the top of the stairs, slowly descended. Listening to Lucas's sincere plea, he felt as if he were hearing a request that carried much more than the words could express. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, Clara stood up, and the two exchanged a look that spoke volumes beyond any conversation they had ever had. "Let's go to the office," Henry said, trying to keep his voice firm, even though everything inside him felt confused. Clara nodded and followed him while Lucas stayed in the hallway, watching the two of them move away and disappear behind the door. Once inside the office, Henry closed the door and turned to Clara, who was clearly waiting for him to start. For a moment, he found himself lost, unsure of how to initiate the conversation. He was used to business meetings, where every word was calculated to achieve a clear goal. But here, in front of Clara, He realized there was no plan, no script to follow. "I was wrong," he finally said, feeling the weight of the words. "I thought I was protecting Lucas, but I think I was just trying to protect myself." Clara remained silent, allowing him to continue. It was the first time she had seen Henry so vulnerable, and she knew she needed to give him space to say what he needed. "When I saw you with him, showing affection, I felt threatened," he admitted, his voice almost breaking. "I thought you were trying to take the place of his mother, and that made me feel like I was losing control over something I barely knew how to hold." Clara took a deep breath, absorbing his words. "Mr. Henry, I never wanted to take your place as Lucas's mother. I know how much she meant to him and to you. But Lucas still is a child, and he needs affection. He needs someone to make him feel he is not alone, that there is someone who cares, who loves him." Henry nodded, feeling Clara's words hit a sensitive spot. "I know that now, and seeing how he reacted to your absence made me realize that I'm not being the father he needs. I thought giving him everything money could buy would be enough, but clearly it isn't." There was a pause. Clara wanted to say something but was cautious. She knew she was dealing with a man not used to admitting his failures, and any poorly placed word could lead him to shut down again. "Mr. Henry," she began, choosing her words carefully, "what Lucas wants more than anything is to feel that you're there for him. He needs you, not just as a provider, but as a father. He needs to know that you will be by his side, even in difficult moments, even when it's not easy." Henry looked away, feeling the weight of what Clara was saying. He knew she was right. For years, he had hidden behind his rigidity, believing that it was strength, but now it felt more like a weakness, an inability to deal with the pain of losing Catherine and the idea of opening his heart to someone again. "I want to fix this," he said, sincerely. "I don't know how, but I want to learn. I want to be the father Lucas deserves, and I want to apologize to you, Clara, for being so unfair. You were just trying to help." Clara smiled, with a touch of sadness in her eyes. "I accept your apology, Mr. Henry, and I'm glad to know you're willing to try, but this won't be easy. It will require patience, openness, and a lot of vulnerability. And if you really want me to come back to care for Lucas, you will need to trust me." Henry nodded. "I trust you, and I want you to come back. Lucas needs you, and I can't deny that. But more than that, I need to change. Not just for him, but for myself as well." The two fell silent for a moment, a silence that was no longer tense, but filled with understanding. It was as if, for the first time, Henry was allowing someone to see beyond his defenses, and Clara knew that this was a rare and precious opportunity. "All right, Mr. Henry, I'll come back," she said finally, with a genuine smile. "But with one condition." Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What?" "That you spend more time with Lucas. Not as an obligation, but as something you will learn to appreciate. He misses you, even if he doesn't know how to say it in words. And I think if you give it a chance, you may find that this is the kind of connection that is worth more than anything." Henry fell silent, absorbing the proposal. He had never been good at letting others set their conditions. But he knew Clara was right. And for the first time, he was willing to give in, to try to do something that was not part of his original plan. "I accept," he said, with a small smile. "I will do it. I will try to be a better father." Clara smiled, and Henry saw in her an expression he had not seen in a long time, a look of hope, not only for what he was promising to do, but for the possibility that he could change. It was something he hadn't believed possible until that moment. When Clara left the office, she found Lucas waiting in the hallway, his eyes filled with expectation. "Clara, are you going to stay?" he asked anxiously. She smiled and nodded. "I will, my dear. And from now on, your daddy will also spend more time with you. What do you think about that?" Lucas looked at Henry, who was standing in the doorway, and his face lit up. "Really, Daddy? You're going to play with me?" Henry knelt to be at eye level with his son, and for the first time in a long time, placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Yes, Lucas, I'll do my best to be with you." Lucas smiled, and in that smile, Henry saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. And for the first time, he felt that maybe it was possible to begin building something new, something real, something that didn't depend on control but on love. In the following days, Clara's presence brought a new energy to the house. Lucas was visibly happier, running around the house and calling for her whenever he wanted to show her a new toy or drawing. But the most surprising change was in Henry. Although he still didn't quite know how to deal with all the feelings that were emerging, he began to make a conscious effort to get closer to Lucas. Henry knew it wouldn't be easy, and there were moments when he felt like he was taking one step forward and 2 steps back. One night, he came home early and saw Lucas and Clara playing a board game in the living room. It was a sight he would have ignored before, but this time he approached and sat on the couch, watching the two with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "Hey, Dad, do you want to play with us?" Lucas asked, his excitement surprising Henry. Henry hesitated for a second, but then nodded. "Sure. How does this game work?" Lucas began to explain the rules with childlike enthusiasm, and Clara stood by, smiling as she watched the two interact. Henry made mistakes in the game and got confused by the rules, but Lucas didn't seem to mind. For him, the simple fact that his father was there, participating, was reason enough to smile. It was a simple night, without grand gestures, but filled with meaning. And for Henry, it felt like a door had opened, allowing him to see a side of Lucas he had never truly known. He realized how smart his son was, how he had a vivid imagination and an incredible ability to make any activity feel like an adventure. And for the first time, Henry realized how much he had lost by shutting himself off after Catherine's death. But there were also moments of difficulty. Henry was still a proud and meticulous man, and sometimes his tendency to want to control everything interfered with his attempt to connect with Lucas. He had ingrained habits, like giving orders in an authoritative tone, and often forgot that he was dealing with a 5-year-old child, not his employees. On one of those occasions, Lucas was painting in the living room and accidentally knocked over a cup of juice onto the floor, creating a colorful mess on the expensive carpet. Henry instinctively got irritated. "Lucas, be careful. Look what you've done. That carpet is expensive." Lucas flinched, as if expecting a bigger scolding, and Henry immediately realized his mistake. He saw the frightened look on his son's face and felt overwhelming guilt. Clara, who was nearby, intervened gently but firmly. "It's okay, Lucas. Everyone makes mistakes," she said, grabbing a cloth to clean up the mess. "What's important is to learn from them and not be afraid to try again. Right, Mr. Henry?" Henry realized what Clara was doing. She was giving him a chance to correct his reaction, to show Lucas that he didn't need to be afraid of making mistakes. Henry took a deep breath, fighting against the impulse to be harsh, and knelt beside Clara, helping her clean up. "I'm sorry, son. I didn't mean to yell," he said, trying to sound kinder. "It was just an accident. Let's clean this up together, okay?" Lucas hesitated, but when he saw his father picking up a cloth to help, he cheered up and smiled. "Okay, Daddy." It was a small victory, but Henry knew he was making progress. He didn't have Clara's natural way with Lucas, but he was trying, and Clara continued to be a calm and balanced presence, helping to smooth the rough edges that arose between father and son. She never directly intervened, but her actions and words served as a subtle guide for Henry, showing him how to be more patient and understanding. The relationship between Clara and Henry also began to transform. If they had previously been just employer and employee, now there was a new layer of respect and understanding between them. Clara saw Henry making a genuine effort to improve, and that made her admire him in a way she hadn't expected. She knew he was a proud man and that admitting his failures wasn't easy, but he was trying, and that made her believe he could really change. One afternoon, Clara was in the garden helping Lucas plant some flowers in small pots. It was an activity he loved, and she always encouraged it, saying that taking care of plants was like taking care of feelings. It needed attention, patience, and affection. Henry got home early and, seeing them in the garden, decided to join them. "Can I help?" he asked shyly, something he wasn't used to being. Lucas looked up, surprised, and smiled. "Of course, Daddy. We're planting flowers. Do you want to plant one too?" Henry grabbed a small shovel and knelt beside Lucas, watching how Clara showed the boy the right way to place the seedling in the pot and cover it with dirt. He didn't know much about gardening, but he began to help, trying to imitate Clara's gentle movements. At some point, he realized he was smiling and that it felt normal, natural. For the first time, it didn't seem like an obligation, but a genuine moment of connection. While they worked together, Clara made a casual observation. "Planting flowers is a great way to teach patience. You take care of them every day, and slowly they grow and bloom. But you have to be there, watering and caring for them, even when it doesn't seem like they're changing." Henry knew she was talking about much more than flowers. He looked at Clara, and in that moment, he felt a deep gratitude that he didn't know how to express. She had been the bridge that reconnected him with Lucas, and without her, he wouldn't have been able to even begin rebuilding that relationship. "Thank you, Clara," he said softly, almost as if testing the words, "for everything." Clara looked at him and smiled, a sincere and warm smile. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Henry. I'm just doing what I think is right." They continued there in the garden, planting and laughing, and for Henry, that was a novelty. He was used to being the center of everything, to having control, but now he was learning to let go of that control and simply be. He didn't have all the answers, and that was scary. But he was beginning to see that perhaps he didn't need to have all the answers to be a good father. Sometimes he just needed to be present. In the following days, changes continued. Henry began dedicating small moments of his day to be with Lucas. They weren't grand gestures, but simple things, like helping him make breakfast, reading a story before bed, or simply listening to him talk about his adventures at school. And gradually, he saw Lucas beginning to trust him more, to open up, to seek his company naturally. For Clara, it was a joy to see the transformation happening. She knew there was still much work ahead, that Henry and Lucas's emotional wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but she was already seeing the first signs of healing. She knew that like any plant they were nurturing, it would need time, patience, and a lot of care. But she was there to support, to care, and that was all that mattered. Weeks passed, and Henry's house began to change. Small changes appeared here and there, signs of a new life blossoming. The previously silent hallways echoed with laughter. The once impeccably organized spaces now had toys scattered about, drawings stuck to the fridge, and even a few flower seedlings in the garden, the result of the afternoons that Lucas, Clara, and Henry spent together. Henry still had his difficult days, where the old tendencies of control and rigidity would resurface, but Clara was always nearby, ready to soften any situation. And slowly, he learned to deal with his own feelings, to recognize that not everything needed to be perfect, that there was beauty in chaos and simplicity. One afternoon, Clara noticed that Lucas seemed quieter than usual. He had played in the garden for a while, but then retreated to his room, where he sat drawing in silence. She went upstairs to see what was going on and found the boy concentrated, drawing figures that looked like a family, a man, a woman, and a child holding hands. "Hey, Lucas, is everything okay?" she asked gently, approaching him. Lucas looked at her and smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I'm fine, Clara. I was just drawing my family. I wish Mom were here." Clara felt her heart ache. It was a feeling she knew Lucas carried with him all the time, even if he didn't express it every day. "I know, dear, and it's normal to miss her. Your mom was a very special person." Lucas nodded and continued drawing. "Daddy is different now, right? He's nicer." Clara laughed softly. "Yes, he is changing, and it's because he loves you very much, Lucas. He's trying to be a better dad for you." Lucas looked at the drawing as if pondering something very important. "Do you think Mom would also like that he's changing?" Clara was momentarily speechless. She wasn't sure how to respond, but then she realized that perhaps the answer lay in Henry's own gestures. "I think so, Lucas. I think she would be very happy to see you both spending more time together and having fun. And deep down, that's what matters, right? Making the people we love happy." Lucas smiled, satisfied with the answer, and continued drawing. Clara stood up and went to the kitchen, where Henry was preparing coffee. He turned when he saw her enter, immediately realizing that something was different. "Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to read the expression on Clara's face. "Lucas is drawing," she said with a soft smile, "but he seemed a little sad. He talked about his mum." Henry felt his chest tighten. Whenever the subject of Catherine came up, he still didn't know how to handle it. It was as if the pain of loss was always there, lurking, waiting for the moment to emerge. But this time, he didn't shy away. Instead, he faced it head-on. "I still don't know what to say to him about that. I've never known." Clara stepped closer and, for the first time, placed her hand on Henry's shoulder. "You don't need to have all the answers. Sometimes just being there and listening is enough. Lucas doesn't expect you to solve everything. He just wants to feel that you are with him." Henry looked at Clara, and in that touch, he felt a deep understanding, a connection that went beyond words. "I'll talk to him," he said, determined. "I'll try." Henry went upstairs and entered Lucas's room. He knocked softly on the door and found his son still drawing. "Hey, champ, can I see what you're doing?" Lucas looked up at him and smiled. "Sure, Daddy. Look, I drew Mom, and us together." Henry sat down beside his son and picked up the drawing, observing the simple, delicate strokes. It was a family he recognized, but also something he felt he was trying to rebuild in some way. "It's beautiful, Lucas," he said sincerely. "Your mom would be very proud of you." Lucas seemed happy to hear that, but after a moment, his expression became serious. "I miss her, Daddy. I miss her a lot." Henry took a deep breath, feeling a familiar pain in his chest, but this time he didn't shy away. Instead, he hugged Lucas and pulled him close, feeling the warmth of his son's body against his. "I miss her too, son, and we will always miss her, but I promise I'll be here for you, for anything you need, always." Lucas tightened the hug, and at that moment, Henry felt as if something was finally falling into place. He didn't know if he could be the perfect father, but he knew he was willing to try. He knew that for the first time, he wasn't running away from the feelings he had always avoided. He was there, present, and that was a beginning. In the following days, Henry began making small changes in his routine to spend more time with Lucas. He decided to leave work earlier a few times a week, not to fulfill an obligation, but because he wanted to be with his son. They played, read stories, and even started doing gardening activities together, a passion Lucas and Clara shared. And it was on one of those afternoons while they were planting new flowers in the garden, that Henry realized something that would change his perspective forever. They were all there, Henry, Clara, and Lucas, laughing and playing, when Lucas suddenly looked at Clara and then at Henry. "You two are nice together," he said, with the simplicity that only a child could have. Henry laughed, thinking Lucas was just being innocent. But Clara looked visibly surprised. She blushed slightly, glancing at the flowers they were planting. But Lucas continued, undeterred. "Why don't you stay here forever, Clara? Then we can be a family." Henry's heart raced. It was an innocent question, but it carried a massive weight. He looked at Clara, who seemed taken aback, not knowing how to respond. And then he realized that the idea didn't frighten him as it might have before. On the contrary, the thought of Clara being a permanent part of their lives felt right. But he knew he couldn't just ask that of Clara, not without understanding what she really wanted. Henry decided he needed time to process what Lucas had said, to reflect on his own feelings. But what became clear to him at that moment was that his life was changing, and he was finally learning to make space for the people around him. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the beginning of something he never imagined he could have. Henry spent the rest of that afternoon in a state of deep reflection. Lucas's innocent and straightforward question had shaken something inside him, bringing to the surface feelings he had been avoiding for a long time. Watching Clara and Lucas playing in the garden, he realized that perhaps he was facing a choice that could change the course of their lives forever. That night, after Lucas went to bed, Henry found Clara in the kitchen, organizing some things before leaving. She still looked a little unsettled by Lucas's earlier comment, and Henry felt that it was the right moment to have a conversation he had been postponing. "Clara, can we talk for a minute?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Clara looked at him, surprised, but nodded. "Sure, Mr. Henry." Henry hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. "What Lucas said today, about you staying here forever, it stirred something in me. I know it was something he said without thinking, but I think it's not something I can ignore." Clara remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She knew that what Henry was about to say was important and didn't want to interrupt his train of thought. "When Catherine died, I shut myself off from the world. I thought that if I just kept control over everything, I would never feel that pain again. But what I didn't realize was that by doing that, I was pushing away the people who mattered most to me. I thought I was protecting Lucas, but in reality, I was just building a wall between us." Henry paused, took a deep breath, and continued. "And then you showed up, Clara, and brought light into my son's life, and mine too. You made me realize that it's not control that keeps a family together, but love, affection, and I don't know how to thank you for that." Clara felt her heart race, surprised by Henry's sincerity. She never imagined he would say those words, and part of her wondered where he was going with this. "Mr. Henry, she began, but he gently raised his hand to interrupt. "Please, call me Henry," he said, with a soft smile. "We're no longer just employer and employee. At least, I hope we're not." Clara laughed, a light and shy laugh, and nodded. "Okay, Henry." Henry stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers, and continued, "I'm not going to ask you to make a decision right now, Clara. I just want you to know that you have a place here, in this house, and in our lives, if you want it. Not as an obligation, but as a choice, because you've become part of our family, and I don't want to lose that." His words hung in the air, and Clara felt tears welling in her eyes. She knew he was being sincere, and that was a huge step for a man who had always been so guarded. "Henry, She hesitated, trying to process everything. "I never wanted to intrude on anyone's space. I always thought my role was to care for Lucas and do my job to the best of my ability, but over time, I started to care so much for him. And for you, too. And if I brought any light into your lives, know that you both brought a lot of light into mine as well." Henry couldn't help but smile. He moved closer, and for the first time, he took her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. "So maybe we can continue bringing light to each other, together." Clara felt the warmth of Henry's hand on hers and smiled back. "I would love that," she said, sincerely. That night, after Clara left, Henry went upstairs to Lucas's room and sat by his son's bed, watching him sleep. He thought about how much had changed in the past few months and how he had almost lost the chance to know the incredible boy that was his son. He realized that no matter how he had failed in the past, there was still time to make things right. In the following days, Henry and Clara began spending more time together, not just as father and nanny, but as two people learning to trust and appreciate each other's company. Clara began to share more of her life with Henry, talking about her mother, who was still ill, and the challenges she faced in balancing work and taking care of her. Henry, in turn, began to open up about Catherine, something he had never done before. He told her how they met, how she made him laugh, and about the pain he felt in losing her. These conversations strengthened the bond between them, and Lucas, who was always the first to notice any change, began to sense the new dynamic. He felt happier than ever, as if something that had been missing in his life was finally in place. And subtly, he continued to plant little seeds of hope. "Clara, you're going to stay forever, right?" he would occasionally ask, and she would just smile and say, "Let's see, Lucas." Henry, watching all this, knew he had to make a definitive choice. He wanted Clara in their lives, not just as Lucas's nanny, but as someone who brought that light into their home every day. And so, he made a decision. One afternoon, while Clara was helping Lucas water the plants in the garden, Henry approached them, holding a small envelope. "Clara, can I talk to you for a moment?" She turned, curious, and nodded. "Of course, Henry." He handed her the envelope, and Clara opened it, surprised to find a small piece of paper inside. It was a letter of recommendation, but what was written was not what she expected. "For Clara, this is not a letter of recommendation because we don't want you to go anywhere else. We want you to stay, not just as someone who takes care of Lucas, but as someone who is part of this family. I know this is a big request, but I want you to know that you will always have a place here if you choose to accept it. With affection, Henry." Clara looked at Henry, surprised, and saw that he was nervous, something she rarely saw in him. "Henry, I don't know what to say," she said, feeling tears streaming down her face. "Just say you'll think about it," he replied, smiling shyly. "And if you decide to stay, I promise to do my best to be the kind of person and father that Lucas, and maybe you, deserve." Clara smiled, and Lucas, who had been watching closely, ran up to them and hugged Clara's legs, looking up at his father. "Does this mean Clara is going to stay forever, Daddy?" Henry knelt down to be at eye level with Lucas and looked at Clara, waiting for her response. She took a deep breath, wiped her tears, and nodded. "Yes, Lucas, I'm going to stay." Henry felt a rush of joy, and for the first time, he realized that this was the family he had never known he needed. Clara, Lucas, and he, all together, ready to face whatever came next as a unit. And in that moment, he knew that although the journey toward love and reconnection would be challenging, it was worth it. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing and supporting us through the thanks button. Until next time.